Hey everyone, it's Dion with Racers360. Welcome to the Daytona International Speedway track guide. We're going through the same Daytona 24-hour course that most of us are racing on. We're on board with Mike Skeen here as we're going to go through all of this. And as we can see in this video, we're on a car that has a lot of speed, the 200-mile-an-hour club, which is awesome. But we're going to be talking about the subtle differences that you'll see between high horsepower cars and lower horsepower cars. You got a little bit of downforce. I'll talk about some of the differences. So no matter what you drive, I think you'll be able to find this useful and get a lot of insights to kind of how we attack a quick lap around Daytona. I know a lot of drivers say Daytona is a really easy racetrack. I actually disagree with that. I think, yes, it's probably easier to get within a second or two, but that last little bit of time is actually really technical. It requires a lot of patience. Daytona, the infield especially, doesn't have a lot of grip, so it can be hard to power down. You get a lot of understeer through the middle of apexes. It can be really bumpy. What you really want to focus here is, the brake zone into turn one, especially tricky in the wet. Transitioning on and off the ovals is really tough. It's really difficult to put power down out of turn six, which is probably one of the most important sections. And then the high-speed bus stop. You've got to be fast in, but you have to be fast out. Those are the main points. So let's start digging in here and going into turn one. So ultimately, yes, we do absolutely want to hug the bottom of the oval while we come through it. But we have to let the car start to get free, start to come up towards this wall before we break to turn one so that you can get as straight as possible into the turn one brake zone. So as you come through the tri-oval, you'll start to let it come up, come up, come up. The camera's pretty much all the way left in Mike's car, so he's actually pretty close to this wall. And in the brake zone, it varies widely here, and you can see the brake markers are very difficult to see as you approach. Here's the one board. So for most cars, we'll be looking to brake somewhere between this one board and the end of the grass. I typically am using the end of the grass as sort of a reference point in visually judging it. I don't necessarily have a specific marker that I use here. So as you come through the tri-oval, identify those braking markers early. Identify the end of the grass early, let the car transition, start conservative, and then start working closer and closer towards the end of the grass. That'll end up being pretty decent brake marker. So it starts to flatten out here. In the wet, one of the most important things is to have your hands as straight as possible over this painted line. It gets really, really slick, especially. Breaking through here, I like to make sure I come down and get pretty close to this first grass, little apex here. And then you transition out and it widens out. A lot of drivers love to go super wide in here because you think that would make sense. But the road actually goes a little off camber. Within about a half, there's a white line here. About a half car width to a car width away is where the road starts to drop off camber here. So you can actually see Mike doesn't use all of the road, and that's what I like to do as well. I don't want to be all the way to the inside. I'm about 3/4 of the way back to the right. But when you come out and you do a track walk, you'll see the road fall away, and that's where I want to avoid. So we're usually coming down to third or second gear here. The important thing is the exit, right? We're braking in. I don't want to carry a lot of speed through the middle of turn one. There's some very subtle differences. So if you're in a lower horsepower car or more of a downforce car, for the most part, we will be apexing the start of this tire wall over here. In a higher horsepower car like Mike's, we're going to be apexing just beyond the end of it. So when we like to learn racetracks, we typically like to learn them backwards. So let's talk about why that is. Well, after here, we have a little bit of a straightaway leading to turn three. We've got the chicane that's going to be flat out in nearly everything. But certain cars have to sacrifice maybe a little bit of speed. So in this high horsepower, low grip car, notice how Mike doesn't end up tracking all the way out. He holds it about mid-road so that he can be easily flat through the chicane. Now, in a lot of cars, probably the vast majority of cars, we can exit all the way out to the right and still be easy flat to this chicane. So what I like to teach is I like to teach starting the weekend off. If it's your first time there, you're not sure yet, or your first time there in a different car, start tracking out mid-curve. So that means a tiny bit later apex out of turn one. And if the chicane's easy flat for you, well, then we want to apex this slightly earlier, use a little bit more track, a little bit more track. And if you can use all of the track and still be easy flat, well, that early apex means you can roll more speed through the middle of turn one, which is going to help. So notice here how I would call Mike's apex just past the end of those tires. So that's going to be what we're going to be looking for in a higher horsepower car. Again, in the lower horsepower cars, it's not a very big difference, right? It's lower horsepower cars, I'm apexing here. Higher horsepower cars, I may be apexing there. Subtle difference, but it matters. It has to be very specific here at Daytona. It's not a track where we can just, kind of miss a little bit of an apex here or there. Hitting our apex in turn 1, turn 3, turn 5, turn 6, and the bus stop. Every one of those we have to hit. It's very, very important around here. So that's a little bit of the difference. We want to be making sure that we're not getting the throttle early here. I'm only starting to pick up the throttle right about now. Nice, consistent back to flat somewhere in this range here. Use a little bit more track if you can. If not, you're here. Definitely not all the way out to the left. These curbs are pretty friendly in most cars. I definitely just want to kiss them, not use all of them. Bam. Let the car be free. And then you've got to hustle it back to the left side of the road except for turn 5. So typically we're braking in a direction towards the outside of the track as long as there's no cars coming out of pit lane. They obviously have right of way. Braking towards the outside of the racetrack, getting all the way out to the left. So this is turn 3, the first of the horseshoes. What's important here is patience and getting down to the apex. So we need a nice long trail brake. We only want to start to pick up the throttle as we can start to unwind our steering wheel. This is going to be an earlier turn-in than you think as well. So we typically think a late apex here. We want a super late aggressive turn-in, but we have to over-slow. When you miss just a little bit of the camber here with this early turn-in, it's just a slight grade of camber in here that you can get in and use. So that's why we have a little bit early of a turn-in point. And we're coming in. And the big reference point here is look how close we are to the start of this apex curve. This looks like it's going to be a really early apex, right? But we come in, we're just wide of it. We hold it. The last little trail brake, part of the trail brake's now. Notice how we're on the apex curbing here, just past the middle of the curve. And right about now, as we're starting to be able to unwind the steering wheel, that's where we're starting to apply our initial throttle application. If you were any earlier than that, you've overslowed or you're just not being patient enough. Super important to be patient here so we have one solid, quick application of the throttle to get back to full throttle. So notice again, important part, we're not way wide of the apex at the start of it. This isn't very traditional. We're coming in, we're pretty close to it. We're just off of it. As the car continues to slow down, we have our last little bit of trail brake on. The car rotates. We get on that apex curving. It's almost like my front wheel is almost in the grass. Start to feed in the throttle, and then make sure we're unwinding the steering wheel and getting out to the exit curve as early as possible. In some cars, I'm actually able to use the last little bit of this curve and out into that little bit of an access road. So it's all about unwinding the steering wheel, getting back to flat as early as possible to get the run down to turn 4. So again, transitioning back here to the right. So turn 4, really fast kink. In lower horsepower cars, in most downforce cars, it's going to be flat. And almost anything else where you don't have downforce, you probably have, I'm going to make up a number here, over 350 horsepower. Again, this is ballparking it. It's probably not quite flat. It's going to be a little bit of a lift. I have not driven a car that I need a brake application here, but I wouldn't put it beyond in a TA1 car like this. Maybe there's a quick little brake. But if you need to lift, we want to do that speed manipulation early. We don't want to turn in and lift here. So when we come in, we want to be lifting back in here, a little bit of coast, and then feeding the throttle in right about this apex point, not much earlier than that. And then I like to use this apex curve. So does Mike. So does almost everyone I know. Adds a little bit of grip to the car, opens up the radius of the corner. There's not a great turn-in marker that I use here. It's sort of feel. It's really just you want to be looking down towards that apex. You want a nice slow hands. You want to be apexing the start of this apex curve, and then making sure we use all of the road on exit. So turn 5 is going to be one of those corners that we see one of the most consistent mistakes. A lot of drivers like to come out of turn 4 and hold it left here. Well, that's going to make turn 4 more difficult for you because now you're not unwinding the steering wheel at exit. You're adding steering input. The car is at its limit. It's going to want to come loose on you. And some drivers will use all the road, but then hustle back to the left to set for turn 5. We don't want to do that at all. Out of turn 4, unwind the steering wheel, let the car be as free as possible. And now I'm just going to brake with straight hands down the inside of the road. Now, that typically would make no sense at all. But what's going to happen here is we're going to brake kind of beyond where you think you're turning in, and you're actually going to come out a little bit wider and be able to come back and turn in and hit your apex. So let's just watch this full speed here. So Mike's going to come in. So notice as he brakes towards the outside of the track, comes back in, and almost sort of double apexes this in a way before getting back to throttle. And that's what we want to see. So we're going to be flat. Typically, our brake zone is going to be somewhere around the start of this access road, maybe just past that, but that's going to be a ballpark. We want to have a nice hard hit, start to trail off, see how the road goes away from us. So if you follow the white line, well, then you're going to apex way too early. But if you brake with your hands straight, you're going to transition out to about the middle of the road, and you've got to be looking through the corner here already. And we're transitioning off the brakes, little bit of last trail brake. And then notice here, it's really hard to get the car to come in and have one long apex. What's typically going to happen is we have our first little bit of an apex. The car is going to typically understeer off a little bit more. This is where we're coming off the last little bit of brakes. Wait for the car. This is important here. It's really easy to get to throttle right now. But if you get to throttle before that last little bit of transition, then we're understeering all the way out to the exit curve, and you can't get back to full throttle. So what's really important is we've got to wait for the car to rotate. See how it's happening right now. The car rotates. It's heading towards that second apex at the end of this apex curve, and that's where we want to feed in the throttle. Only once we can really start to unwind that steering wheel. Notice the theme here at Daytona is patience to throttle, because that means you can have one nice aggressive throttle application, and you come out and you use all of this exit curve early out to this exit curve. That's really important, because that means you have your eyes up and you're unwinding the steering wheel. Come out. Now we're setting up for turn 6. Turn 6, one of the most important corners on this racetrack. It is really easy to roll too much speed through the middle of turn 6. So let's just play this full speed here. We're coming in, we're transitioning out of the infield onto the road course, and now it opens up really wide here, which makes it feel like we can roll more speed. But simply when we talk about what's important here, the exit. Getting back to full throttle as early as possible to carry our speed all the way down to the bus stop. That's what we care the most about here. So a great reference point for our brake zone is going to be roughly this first access road. That's where most cars will be braking. Lower horsepower cars, you might be able to get just beyond that, but ballpark, that's really going to be a great place to identify and use as a reference point for the start of your weekend. See, Mike's braking just before it here. Coming in, just past this last little bit of curve on our right-hand side is going to be another decent reference point for our turn-in point. To be honest with you as a driver, I never really noticed this. I more just focused down on the apex curve, and I judge my turn-in point by the apex curve. But we like to try to give you as much different reference points as possible while you're out there. So again, focus on the exit. You want to be coming off, transitioning off the last little bit of brakes. You want to be apexing right about mid-curve, right where the curve sticks out the furthest. That's going to be our apex point. You're not going to be touching the throttle any earlier than that. We're coming in right here. It gets really bumpy. So in higher horsepower cars, it can be really difficult to put the power down. If you're fighting the power down, make sure you're not too early to throttle, and then make sure you maybe slow the car down a little bit more. Again, if you sacrifice 2-3 miles an hour through the middle of the corner, just so that you can get back to flat earlier, that's typically going to pay off for you as you arrive down to the bus stop, because it'll be faster all the way down there, right? So coming in, transitioning to the throttle. A lot of drivers love to use all of the road out to your right-hand side. Notice here, even in this really high horsepower car, Mike's still not quite using all of the road out there. Hugging it a little bit tighter in, because it gets really dirty and really bumpy out over there. So we like to be about a half car width to a car width off that yellow curb. You definitely want to be back to full throttle at least by here, but really ideally in most cars, I'm back to full throttle about here, carrying it all the way to the bus stop. Transition, again, in the wet, be careful with this transition. You want to have your hands as straight as possible as you go over this painted line. Notice here, Mike comes in, sort of almost apexes the grass, lets the car be free, and anything beyond like a spec Miata maybe, we wanted the car be free up to the wall. In those Miatas where you really don't need to, then maybe staying closer to the bottom is okay. But most of the time, we want to come up, be free, slowly transition down to the bottom of the oval here. I'd like to see Mike be just a little bit lower, but I know this is practice laps, so sometimes we're practicing different things, transitioning for the bus stop. So as we transition for the bus stop, one of the most intimidating corners on this racetrack, let's first talk about the braking markers. They're up here on the wall. We can see there's a 3, a 2, and a 1. Ballpark, you're going to be in almost everything getting inside the 3 board. I've driven cars where I'm braking at the 2.5, 2 board, what we're seeing Mike going to do here. I've driven cars that I'm braking just inside the 1 board. So this is a very wide range. Just to start off your weekend, it doesn't hurt to start at the 3 board and slowly work your way in from there. For some of you, that's going to be crazy early. It's tough to talk about brake zones. So let's talk about what matters here. So again, let's just watch this full speed one time through. Coming in, braking just inside the 3 board, transitioning into the bus stop, using all of that first curve, a little bit of the second curve, a little bit of the third curve, back to full throttle, all of the fourth curve, and we have a long straight again down to turn 1. So what matters out of here is the exit. But I don't want to make that lose sight of the entry, because you can roll a lot of speed through the entry as well. This is a really difficult corner because entry speed matters, not as much as the exit, but it does matter. So we're coming in, turning in a decently past the 1 board, right? It's probably 3-4 car lengths past the 1 board. So what's the most important part here? The first curve and the last curve are the most important parts here. We want to use every little bit of both of them. So coming in, that by using more of the first curve, we're able to slowly turn in more and open up the radius of this corner. When you have to avoid this curve, if you miss this curve, it starts to get a lot tighter in here. Now, I know for some weekends, there's little white strips that are put down here. During the 24-hour when we run here, they're usually there. I still use every little bit of this curve all race long. I don't want to say that in any car you can run over that. Every situation is different. I would just, if at all possible for speed, you've got to use this. If you're having to sacrifice not using this curve for the car security or endurance, you're going to be losing a lot of time. So whatever you can do to run over this curve, if you can, you got to do it. Notice here, Mike is front left tire almost in the dirt here. And you can actually see there's a gap between the grass and the back of the curve. That's from people running that much curve, they're getting into the dirt. Now, typically what ends up happening is a little bit of a divot forms on the inside of the curve on this one and the inside of the curve over here. So you just got to be very specific not to drop a tire on the inside, but you got to use every little bit of it. So see how, again, Mike's apexing the start of this curve. It's an earlier apex than, again, you would think. Every little bit of it. Continue to turn left just slightly more. Before coming back to the right, I like to just have my front right tire go on the edge of this one. You want enough speed to where you are starting to come off the brakes probably in here, and then you're coasting. The car takes you about 3/4 of the way back to the left, and I'm not getting back to throttle until I've got my car pointed towards this third curve. You've got to make sure you're not too early to throttle here, or else you'll understeer, have to lift off of it, and now you're losing all the way down to turn 1. This is one of the most important parts of Daytona is once you apply the throttle, you've got to have a consistent, nice, smooth arc up to full throttle and not have to lift off of it. Those lifts, once you get back to full throttle and have to lift off of it, will cost you a lot at Daytona. So you start to get the car angled towards the third curve. This is where I'm starting to feed the throttle back in. Some drivers love to use more of this third curve. And to be honest with you, some weekends I use a lot of it. Some weekends I barely use any of it. This one sort of depends on how the weekend's going. I'm kind of take it or leave it, whatever works for you. But what's important here is unwind the steering wheel as early as possible right now. There's sort of a hump in here, so the rear likes to get nice and light. So it's really important to open those hands to use every little bit of this curve, because the earlier you can get the car straight, the earlier you can get back to full throttle. So notice here, bam, every little bit of it Mike uses, and then he lets the car be free up to the wall before transitioning down to the banking. And you can kind of see here, it's a little bit hard, but as he comes out of here, the car does a little bit of a dance. After the third curve, before the fourth curve, a lot of higher horsepower cars love to do this little bit of dance. So just anticipate that. Opening your hands will really help with that. And again, transitioning out, use every little bit of the road out. Once again, in what conditions? that painted line that you cross over is sketchy, really, really low grip. So you want to have your hands straight. At all of these curbs, the bus stop can be really tricky in the wet. You kind of still have to use that first curb, but you don't want to be off all inputs. You don't want to be braking over it. You don't want to be throttling over it. You want your hands as straight as possible. And you just try to avoid all of the paint, all of the curbs as much as possible. This is a tough place in the wet. Transition off. There's going to be in the wet more grip than you would think in the banking because the water kind of falls off of it. But yeah, that's how we go for a fast lap around Daytona. As always, if you have any questions for our Racers360 team, don't hesitate to reach out, team@racers360.com. Send us an email. Of course, we'd love to work with you one-on-one. Send us in your videos, and we can go through, analyze, and tell you exactly what you can do to improve around Daytona with your driving in your car. Coaching has to be personalized. We know that. We're big believers in that. So while we hope this is helpful, we hope that you really use our personalized coaching services to take your driving to the next level. Hope you've enjoyed it, and best of luck. We'll see you on track soon.